While Washington celebrated the collapse of the Soviet Union and declared itself the undisputed master of the global order, a quiet economic revolution across Asia was already making that triumphant narrative obsolete before the champagne glasses were even dry. The unipolar moment that every American president, every major think tank, and every foreign policy establishment figure repeated like scripture was, from an economic standpoint, never more than a comforting illusion built on selective blindness. What the strategists missed while fixating on Moscow is now reshaping supply chains, manufacturing dominance, and the price of every consumer good sitting on American store shelves today. The structural decline of Western hegemony did not begin with China's rise or Russia's resurgence. It began 75 years ago when European empires crumbled and an entire continent started catching up. This is not about ideology or decline narratives designed to generate panic among cable news audiences desperate for simple explanations of complex shifts. This is about the hard mathematics of global power, industrial output, and technological leadership that no amount of political rhetoric can override or wish away. If you want to understand the real mechanisms driving our world beyond the headlines, support this video with a like, share it, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Now to the facts that Washington spent 3 decades trying not to see. For roughly 150 years, from the dawn of the 19th century through the final gunshots of World War II, Western civilization held unchallenged dominance over the planet. Britain sat at the apex of this order, its industrial revolution generating military and naval supremacy the way America's dollar reserve status underwrites influence today. A handful of European imperial powers controlled global trade routes, extracted resources from colonies spanning Africa and Asia, and monopolized scientific advancement with virtually no competition. Their technological edge was not marginal. It was overwhelming, comparable to the gap between a modern aircraft carrier and a wooden sailing vessel in strategic terms. This was genuine hegemony in every measurable dimension: economic output, military projection, educational infrastructure, and the capacity to dictate political arrangements across entire continents without meaningful resistance. No Asian, African, or Latin American power possessed the industrial base, the institutional framework, or the financial architecture to challenge this order on any front. The Western world did not merely lead, it dominated so thoroughly that alternative centers of power were essentially unimaginable to the strategists of that era. But every structural advantage in history eventually generates the conditions for its own erosion. And this one was no different whatsoever. World War II did not simply redraw borders on a map. It shattered the entire imperial architecture that had sustained Western global dominance for over a century. India gained independence. The People's Republic of China was formally declared, and colonies across Southeast Asia and Africa began breaking free in rapid succession. The United States effectively inherited the role of global imperial center, stepping into a position that Congress never formally authorized, but successive administrations assumed almost by default. Think of it as inheriting a sprawling multinational corporation without ever reading the fine print on the liabilities hidden deep inside the balance sheet. Washington competed with the Soviet Union as the two dominant superpowers, each projecting military force and ideological influence across every continent and ocean on the planet. The United States held clear advantages in economic output and technological innovation, but the terrifying reality of two nuclear arsenals aimed at each other overshadowed everything. Proxy wars from Korea to Vietnam to Angola consumed attention, resources, and strategic bandwidth that might otherwise have been directed toward understanding deeper structural shifts. But underneath this superpower rivalry, A far more consequential transformation was already gathering momentum across the most populated continent on Earth. Asia, home to 60% of the world's population, had been the center of gravity for the global economy for 2,000 years before European imperialism temporarily disrupted that ancient pattern. What began after 1950 was not merely political independence, but a deep generational process of economic, educational, and industrial reconstruction that would eventually reshape everything. Literacy rates climbed for the first time across populations numbering in the hundreds of millions, and mass public education systems were built essentially from nothing. Basic infrastructure that European imperial administrations had never bothered to construct because colonies existed for extraction rather than development, finally began taking shape across the region. South Korea transformed from a war-devastated agricultural economy into an industrial powerhouse within a single generation, a feat with almost no historical precedent anywhere. Taiwan, Singapore, and Hong Kong, the so-called Asian tigers, demonstrated that rapid industrialization was not a Western monopoly, but a replicable process available to disciplined societies. Then in the late 1970s, China began its economic opening, an event whose significance most American strategists would not grasp for nearly 3 decades afterward. Year by year, the gap between the industrialized West and the rising East narrowed, but almost nobody in Washington was paying serious attention to the trend. The Cold War functioned as an enormous strategic distraction, focusing every intelligence agency, every defense budget line item, and every presidential briefing on the Soviet threat. It was easy, even rational, to take your eyes off the rise of Korea or the quiet industrialization of coastal China when nuclear annihilation felt like a genuine possibility. The bipolar framing made the world look like a two-empire affair, a chess match between Washington and Moscow, where no other players truly mattered on the board. But this framing was fundamentally misleading because it obscured the most important economic story of the 20th century, unfolding in plain sight across Asian factory floors. My memory of what American strategists were saying about China in 1991 and 92 is that they were saying almost nothing of consequence. China was viewed as a poor country that assembled cheap goods for American consumer markets, useful perhaps as a continuing check on residual Russian influence. The idea that Beijing might become a peer competitor, let alone a technological leader in manufacturing and heavy industry, would have been dismissed as absurd fantasy. But that dismissal was itself the product of a strategic culture that measured power in aircraft carriers and nuclear warheads rather than industrial output. When the Soviet Union formally dissolved in December 1991, the euphoria in Washington was not subtle. It was total, and it was intoxicating beyond measure. The end of history was declared with academic confidence. The unipolar moment was celebrated in every serious foreign policy journal, and America was crowned the indispensable nation. Every superlative the English language could produce was deployed to describe a dominance that, from an economic perspective, was already being structurally undermined by forces operating steadily. The neoconservatives believed their own headlines, and strategists like Zbigniew Brzezinski openly envisioned the United States achieving dominance over the entire Eurasian landmass, with Ukraine serving as the geopolitical pivot. I witnessed this euphoria firsthand, in the think tanks, in the universities, and in the corridors of power in Washington, where questioning American supremacy was treated as intellectual heresy. There were serious debates in the 1990s about whether Asia's rise was even real, with prominent articles dismissing the entire phenomenon as a myth. But if you were looking at this as an economist, as I was throughout that period, the data told an unambiguous and increasingly dramatic story. Asia was rising structurally, and no amount of triumphalist rhetoric from Washington could alter the underlying mathematics of converging industrial and technological capacity across the Pacific. The Ukraine war now stands as perhaps the most dramatic recent demonstration that the unipolar fantasy has collided violently with geopolitical reality on the ground. Washington assumed it could expand NATO to Russia's borders, place its strategic pieces wherever it wanted on the Eurasian chessboard, and face no meaningful consequences. The expectation was that sanctions would cripple Russia financially, that military pressure would force capitulation, or that some form of internal subversion would produce regime change in Moscow. Every single one of those assumptions proved to be a complete illusion, exposing the gap between Washington's self-image and its actual operational capacity in a contested environment. President Putin effectively said that American expansion into Russia's strategic backyard would not happen on his watch, and he possessed the means to enforce that position. Meanwhile, China has moved far beyond the catching up phase. In manufacturing and heavy industry across nearly every category, Beijing is now substantially ahead of the United States. This does not mean American power has collapsed, because the United States still possesses enormous economic weight, technological assets, and unmatched destructive military capacity across multiple domains. But the era of unchallenged American hegemony is over, and the sooner Washington's strategic class accepts that structural reality, the safer the world will be. The strategic architecture behind that expansion deserves closer examination because it reveals how Washington's ambitions systematically outpaced its actual capacity to deliver results. Brzezinski's grand chessboard framework explicitly designated Ukraine as the geopolitical pivot through which American influence would permanently penetrate the Eurasian heartland. This was not a defensive posture designed to protect existing allies. It was an offensive strategy aimed at projecting power directly into Russia's historical sphere. NATO grew from 16 members to 32 in barely 2 decades, absorbing former Warsaw Pact states and even former Soviet republics along the way. Each expansion was treated in Washington as cost-free, irreversible, and fundamentally unthreatening to any rational actor observing from Moscow's perspective. That assumption was the geopolitical equivalent of a corporation aggressively acquiring every competitor in sight without once stress testing its own balance sheet. When the acquisition attempt finally reached Ukraine, it triggered precisely the devastating counter-response that decades of institutional groupthink had deemed impossible. The entire enterprise of eastward expansion now faces an existential credibility crisis that no amount of summit communiques or defense spending pledges can resolve. Consider what Washington actually deployed against Russia and how comprehensively each instrument failed to achieve its stated objective in this conflict. The Federal Reserve's financial architecture weaponized the dollar through the most aggressive sanctions regime ever imposed on a major economy in modern history. The Pentagon funneled tens of billions in military hardware through NATO allies, effectively waging a proxy war designed to bleed Russia into strategic exhaustion. The intelligence community pursued every available channel for internal destabilization, from supporting opposition networks to information warfare campaigns targeting Russian domestic cohesion. Imagine the 3 most powerful institutional instruments in American statecraft: the Treasury, the military, and the intelligence apparatus, all firing simultaneously at one target. That target not only survived, but actively adapted, redirecting energy exports to China and India, while building alternative financial settlement systems outside dollar jurisdiction. The Global South, rather than isolating Moscow as Washington expected, largely refused to participate in the sanctions regime and expanded bilateral trade instead. What was supposed to demonstrate irresistible American leverage instead became a live demonstration of its increasingly visible limitations across every domain. The critical nuance that separates serious analysis from cable news panic is understanding that diminishing dominance is not the same as collapse. The United States still fields the most expensive military apparatus on the planet, maintains significant technological advantages in aerospace and certain semiconductor design categories, and controls reserve currency. Its network of alliances, while strained, still spans both the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, with basing infrastructure no other nation can match. Destructive capacity remains unparalleled. No rational actor doubts that Washington could inflict catastrophic damage on any adversary it chose to target directly. But power in the 21st century is fundamentally relative, measured not against your own historical peak, but against competitors who refuse to stand still. When China produces more steel, ships, electric vehicles, and solar panels than the United States and Europe combined, the arithmetic of relative power shifts decisively. The snapshot of any single year flatters Washington. The trend line over decades tells an entirely different and far more consequential story. The 75-year arc that began with European decolonization is now reaching its structural conclusion in ways that can no longer be denied or deferred. Western power peaked around 1950, when the United States accounted for nearly half of global manufacturing output, and Europe still controlled residual imperial networks. The Cold War masked the subsequent decline by channeling attention toward a single ideological rivalry that felt existential and all-consuming to everyone involved. The unipolar euphoria of the 1990s denied the decline by constructing an entire intellectual framework around permanent American supremacy as historical inevitability. The neoconservative foreign policy establishment then built a grand strategy on ignoring the decline, launching military interventions premised on dominance that was already eroding. Now in the mid-2020s, the consequences of that triple failure of perception arrive simultaneously on multiple fronts without convenient sequencing. A war in Europe that the United States cannot win on its preferred terms persists alongside a technological competitor it cannot sanction into submission. The global economic order no longer revolves exclusively around Washington's preferences, and pretending otherwise has become strategically dangerous rather than merely intellectually dishonest. The forward-looking implications demand examination, because the policy choices made in the next decade will determine whether adjustment is managed or catastrophic. If Washington continues operating on the assumption of unipolar dominance, extending military commitments across every theater while attempting to contain China economically, strategic overextension becomes inevitable. The defense budget already consumes resources that could modernize domestic infrastructure, and every new commitment stretches an industrial base that produces warships at a fraction of China's rate. Supply chains for critical goods, from rare earth minerals to pharmaceutical precursors, remain vulnerable to geopolitical disruption precisely because diversification was neglected during decades of assumed dominance. The Taiwan Strait, the Middle East, and the Arctic each represent potential flashpoints where an overcommitted military could face simultaneous demands it simply cannot meet. The alternative is a realistic recalibration of American foreign policy that honestly accounts for a genuinely multipolar distribution of economic and military power. This is not an abstract academic debate conducted in seminar rooms for the benefit of tenured professors writing papers nobody outside their department reads. This determines whether American taxpayer dollars continue funding commitments that exceed the nation's actual strategic capacity to sustain them over time. The question confronting every serious analyst now is not whether the unipolar moment has ended, but whether Washington's policy establishment possesses the institutional capacity to adapt. Vietnam demonstrated the limits of American military power against a determined adversary fighting on its own terrain with external support from major powers. Ukraine is demonstrating the limits of American economic warfare against a nuclear-armed commodity exporter, with alternative markets willing to absorb everything it produces. China's manufacturing dominance demonstrates the limits of American technological containment against an economy that graduates more engineers annually than America graduates college students. Each failure individually could be rationalized as circumstantial. Together, they constitute a pattern that only institutional denial can continue to ignore going forward. The structural economic changes documented across 75 years of data are not reversible through tariffs, sanctions, or aircraft carrier deployments to the Western Pacific. They reflect the fundamental rebalancing of a global economy returning to the distribution pattern that prevailed for 2 millennia before European industrialization temporarily disrupted it. Acknowledging this reality is not defeatism. It is the prerequisite for any foreign policy that serves American interests rather than flattering American vanity. The limits of American power are not a future possibility that prudent planning might prevent. They are the present reality confirmed by every major strategic engagement of the past half-century. 75 years of structural economic change transferred manufacturing capacity, technological capability, and financial leverage from west to east in a process no single policy could reverse. The failures in Vietnam and Ukraine bookend this transformation, demonstrating that military supremacy cannot substitute for industrial and economic dominance indefinitely against determined opposition. China's emergence as a manufacturing and technological superpower is not a temporary anomaly, but the restoration of historical patterns that European imperialism only briefly interrupted. The data does not support the unipolar framework. The trend lines do not support containment as currently practiced, and the industrial base does not support simultaneous confrontation. Washington spent 3 decades constructing a foreign policy for a world that existed only in its own strategic documents and conference presentations. The world that actually exists outside those documents now demands acknowledgement, and the cost of continued denial compounds with every year of strategic miscalculation. Whether the American policy establishment can see the landscape it spent a generation refusing to look at will determine the trajectory of global stability. Brzezinski's grand chessboard was never merely an academic exercise published for peer review in obscure foreign policy journals read by graduate students. It was an operational blueprint adopted by successive administrations that treated Ukraine as the indispensable lever for prying Eurasia permanently open to American influence. The entire framework assumed that Russia would remain too weak, too corrupt, and too internally fragmented to mount any meaningful resistance to NATO's eastward march. That assumption held just long enough to become institutionally entrenched in every major national security document produced between 1993 and 2014. But assumptions embedded in strategy documents do not alter the industrial capacity of adversaries who spend decades quietly rebuilding their military manufacturing base. Moscow watched NATO absorb 14 new members and concluded that diplomatic protests would never be treated as anything more than background noise. The Kremlin's response was not impulsive, but methodical, modernizing nuclear delivery systems, rebuilding conventional forces, and cultivating energy dependencies across Europe as strategic insurance. When the confrontation finally arrived over Ukraine, Washington discovered that its opponent had prepared for precisely this scenario with far greater seriousness. The sanctions campaign launched against Russia in 2022 was designed to function as a financial neutron bomb that would destroy the economy while leaving political structures intact. Treasury officials openly predicted that the ruble would collapse, that Russian banks would be severed from global capital markets, and that inflation would trigger domestic unrest within months. Instead, the ruble recovered after an initial plunge. Energy revenues surged as oil and gas found eager buyers across Asia, and Russian industrial output adapted. What Washington failed to model was that sanctioning a major commodity exporter simultaneously punishes every economy dependent on those commodities for basic functioning. European manufacturers watched energy costs triple, while their Russian competitors accessed discounted inputs through pipelines redirected eastward toward Chinese and Indian refineries. The Global South's refusal to enforce sanctions was not a diplomatic inconvenience, but a structural verdict on the limits of dollar-denominated coercion. India alone doubled its purchases of Russian crude, refining it and re-exporting petroleum products to the very European markets that had sanctioned Moscow. The weaponization of finance, once considered Washington's most devastating instrument short of military force, revealed itself as a depreciating asset. The military dimension exposed equally uncomfortable truths about the gap between American defense procurement rhetoric and actual industrial production capacity on factory floors. The United States burned through artillery ammunition stocks designated for a major theater war in roughly the first year of supplying Ukraine's defensive operations. Replacing Javelin missiles, Stinger systems, and 155mm shells required production timelines measured in years, while consumption rates were measured in weeks. American defense contractors optimized for profit margins on exquisite platforms discovered they could not rapidly scale production of basic munitions that wars actually consume. Meanwhile, Russia ramped wartime production to levels that exceeded entire NATO European output combined, drawing on an industrial base Western analysts had dismissed as obsolete. The contrast illuminated a fundamental vulnerability. America builds small numbers of extraordinarily expensive weapon systems, while potential adversaries manufacture adequate systems in overwhelming quantities. This is not a procurement debate confined to Pentagon budget hearings. It is a strategic mismatch with existential implications for every security guarantee Washington currently extends. The arsenal of democracy that won World War II has become an arsenal of precision boutique manufacturing that cannot sustain protracted, high-intensity conflict. China's role in this recalibration extends far beyond providing diplomatic cover for Moscow at United Nations votes or purchasing discounted Russian energy exports. Beijing absorbed the Ukraine precedent as a comprehensive stress test, revealing exactly which American instruments of coercion function and which ones shatter upon contact with reality. Every sanctions package, every asset freeze, every swift disconnection provided Chinese financial engineers with a detailed blueprint of vulnerabilities to engineer around before any potential confrontation. The cross-border interbank payment system that China built now processes transactions in yuan across 139 countries without touching American clearing infrastructure. Chinese semiconductor fabrication, once considered hopelessly dependent on Western lithography equipment, has accelerated domestic alternatives under pressure that sanctions paradoxically intensified rather than prevented. Rare earth processing, shipbuilding capacity, electric vehicle battery production, and solar panel manufacturing all represent domains where Chinese dominance is now structural rather than cyclical. The technological containment strategy requires allies to sacrifice commercial opportunities indefinitely, while China develops substitutes that eliminate the leverage containment was designed to preserve. Washington essentially handed Beijing a detailed map of every choke point in the global financial system, and then expressed surprise when Beijing started building roads around them. The restoration of Asia's centrality to the global economy represents not an aberration from historical norms, but a return to patterns that prevailed continuously for 2 millennia. European industrial dominance lasted roughly 150 years, a historical parenthesis that felt permanent only to those living inside it without broader chronological perspective. China alone accounted for approximately 30% of global economic output in 1800, before the Opium Wars began dismantling its commercial sovereignty systematically. India contributed another 25%, meaning the two Asian giants together produced more than half the world's goods before European imperialism reversed that ratio. What we have witnessed since 1950 is the mathematical reversion of that temporary disruption, accelerated by mass education, infrastructure investment, and technology transfer. The catching up phase is definitively over. The going ahead phase is now visible in patent filings, manufacturing output, and infrastructure deployment metrics that favor Asia decisively. This does not diminish genuine American achievements in innovation, higher education, and entrepreneurial culture that remain globally significant and widely admired. But it does mean that strategic frameworks premised on permanent Western superiority are arguing against 2,000 years of economic history using 75 years of data. The real balance of power going forward will be determined not by military budgets alone, but by industrial depth, energy security, demographic trajectories, and alliance resilience. America spends more on defense than the next 10 nations combined, yet produces fewer warships annually than China builds in a single quarter at its coastal shipyards. European NATO members pledged 2% GDP defense spending targets over a decade ago, and most still have not met that threshold despite war on their continent. The demographic arithmetic compounds these challenges. China and India together graduate more engineers and scientists annually than America and Europe graduate total university students combined. Energy transition technologies, from batteries to solar cells to electric vehicles, are now dominated by Chinese manufacturers who control supply chains from mineral extraction to finished product. Financial architecture is fragmenting as BRICS nations construct parallel payment systems, currency swap arrangements, and development banks that bypass traditional Western-controlled institutions entirely. The dollar remains dominant, but its monopoly position erodes incrementally, with every bilateral trade agreement settled in yuan, rupees, or rubles outside Western clearing systems. Each of these shifts individually appears manageable. Collectively, they constitute a tectonic redistribution of global capacity that no single policy intervention can reverse. The 75-year arc from Western hegemony through unipolar illusion to multipolar reality has now reached its definitive conclusion in the strategic record for anyone willing to read it honestly. Vietnam proved that military supremacy could not defeat a determined adversary fighting for national sovereignty on its own territory with external support from committed allies. Ukraine proved that financial weaponization could not collapse a major commodity exporting economy integrated into alternative trading networks spanning the Asian continent and the global south. China's industrial ascendancy proved that technological containment could not prevent a civilization representing 1/5 of humanity from achieving and then surpassing Western manufacturing and innovation benchmarks. 3 failures across 3 distinct domains of American power projection: military, financial, and technological, do not constitute coincidence, but rather confirm structural limits. The world that actually exists in 2025 is one where multiple centers of economic gravity, military capability, and technological innovation coexist, whether Washington acknowledges that architecture or not. Acknowledging multipolarity is not surrender. It is the minimum prerequisite for constructing foreign policy that protects American interests without provoking catastrophic miscalculation born from outdated assumptions. The question is no longer whether the unipolar moment has ended, but whether the institutions that built their identity around it can adapt before the cost of denial becomes irreversible.